I am not here to argue about whether climate change exists or not. Because seriously, ain't nobody got time for that. In 2016, the Paris Agreement was signed. Through this document, countries around the world committed to a common goal: preventing the average global temperature from rising more than 2 degrees Celsius and trying really hard to stop it from warming more than just 1.5 degrees Celsius. Right now, we're at 1.1 degrees of warming. Scientists think we'll hit 1.5 degrees within the next 10 years and 2 degrees by 2050. So we only have about 30 years left to prevent more extreme weather systems, large-scale crop failure, new disease mutations, ecosystem collapse, and the catastrophic destruction of the planet as a life-sustaining environment. But instead of bogging you down with all of that doom and gloom, I want to talk to you about what we can do to help meet the Paris Agreement goal. Last spring, I turned in my master's thesis about this very topic. Over the course of the last year, as well as during the 6 months it took me to write, I spent a lot of time talking about climate change with practically anyone who would listen. And I learned a few things from that. First, climate change is really abstract. 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, 36.8 gigatons of carbon dioxide emissions, 11 feet of sea level rise. I can keep throwing out statistics, but none of them are tangible at all. Really, what is 412 parts per million of atmospheric carbon? Is that a lot? Is that a little? Normal? Abnormal? For most people, these numbers mean virtually nothing. And it's really hard to get motivated to fix something when it's hard to grasp what that something even is. The second thing I learned is it's also hard to get motivated to fix something that's as massive as climate change. As big as the human ego is, these giant problems are really good at making us feel insignificant and unhelpful. A lot of the people I talked to felt like the only ones with the power to fix climate change are big governments and wealthy industries. We'll just let those car makers and utility companies figure all that out, right? No. There's actually strength in numbers. Take your small impact and multiply that by 7.6 billion people. That'll get us somewhere. But what kinds of impacts actually make a difference? I mean, we could probably brainstorm 100 ideas. Eat less beef, stop flying, get rid of your car, move into a tiny apartment. Those are some of the big ones. But that last one hasn't been getting very much attention, which is why that's the one I've been focusing on, which brings me back to my thesis, which was titled New Cities as a Tool to Combat Climate Change. Basically, the gist of my thesis is that we should all live in a high-density city as a way of shrinking our carbon footprint, meeting the Paris Agreement goal, and saving the planet. But before I get too bogged down in all that, I want to make a little clarifying disclaimer about some of the words I'm using. City and urban are defined very differently all over the planet, and they rarely include a mention of density. When it comes to climate change, I am more interested in high density than I am in urbanness or population numbers, because the truth is that high density living is generally better for the planet than low density living, particularly in developed countries. Now, I grew up in a town of 944 people. I may live in Manhattan now, but I'm just as much country as I am city, so I'm not trying to fan any of these urban versus rural fights. But I'd probably encourage some of the New York versus LA ones. New York is high density, LA isn't. An international meta-analysis of greenhouse gas emissions showed that on average, urban residents generate significantly lower greenhouse gas emissions than residents living elsewhere in the same country. That's because high-density lifestyles have a lot of environmentally friendly characteristics that low-density lifestyles either don't or can't, like walkability, access to mass public transportation, mixed-use developments, and smaller living spaces, which means less space per person to heat, cool, and light. Transportation and heating, cooling, and lighting are generally our biggest personal sources of greenhouse gas emissions. So if we can cut back on those, we can make a dent in our collective climate impact and hopefully start to see our greenhouse gas emissions begin to drop. Unfortunately, people aren't just going to make these big lifestyle changes like getting rid of their car for no tangible reason. Between the massiveness and the abstractness of the climate change problem, most people just don't have the motivation to make those kinds of changes. There needs to be some sort of catalyst in order for those changes to happen. Like moving. Moving always forces people to change the way they live. So if people move to a high-density city where the easiest way to live is also the most environmentally friendly way to live, then moving can drastically reduce someone's carbon footprint practically overnight. That's the kind of time scale we need. Now, I do see two immediate problems with my plan to encourage everyone to move to a high-density city. First, moving isn't always easy. It's time-intensive, it's labor-intensive, it's money-intensive. But if we're serious about saving the planet, and thereby saving the future of humans on this planet, we'll find a way to help people move. That help will probably come in the form of a government program that helps alleviate the burdens and obstacles associated with moving. The exact policy specifications are negotiable, but any plan should focus on building and maintaining long-term, sustainable communities. The second problem I see is more of an existential one. A lot of the world's current high-density cities are threatened by climate change and may not exist in 2050, at least not in their current form and location. Even New York is among one of the most climate-vulnerable cities in the world. But despite those threats, most cities continue to grow. Right now, more than half of the world's population lives in an urban center, and that percentage is growing rapidly. The UN estimates that so many new people are moving to cities that we'll need to build the equivalent of 7 New York cities every year just to keep up with their housing needs. That's 230 new Manhattans, or new New York cities, or 1,200 new Manhattans just between now and 2050. So between the climate change threats to our current cities and between the current threats to our current cities and the growing urban populations, there's a capacity problem we need to solve in order for my plan to work. And I see only one reasonable way of doing that. We have to build new cities from scratch. The last thing I learned while talking to people about climate change is everyone thinks I'm crazy. Building new cities from scratch sounds absurd. That is never going to happen. Well, building cities from scratch is actually not a new idea. Ramses II, ancient pharaoh of Egypt, did it more than 3,000 years ago, and we've done it countless times since all over the planet for all kinds of reasons. The main thing that's new about my plan is the reason: saving the planet from climate change. Usually around this time is when everyone starts wondering how exactly we're supposed to fund the construction of 230 new New York cities in the next 32 years. Well, supply and demand is already fueling rapid construction all over the planet. China, for example, is building more new cities than I can even keep track of. They're just generally pretty car-centric rather than the kind of high-density cities I think we need to be building. There's also new cities being built in Saudi Arabia and India and Indonesia, Malaysia, Nigeria, Kenya, and more than 24 countries all over the world. So construction is happening, and it's going to continue to happen. The money is there. I just want to redirect it to more sustainable projects, high-density projects. cities with modestly sized living quarters, robust public transportation, and complete neighborhoods where your work, school, grocery store, and doctors are no more than a short walk away from home. I don't think that's that crazy. And in the face of looming climate disaster, I think that sounds pretty sane to me. The next thing everyone always wonders is where we're supposed to be building all these new cities. As climate changes, agriculture is going to move to follow the water and optimal temperatures, leaving behind a lot of newly empty land. We can use that old farmland to build new cities rather than destroying more wilderness. There's also a lot of cities that aren't facing severe threats from climate change. So there's a possibility for us to retrofit and densify some of those places, like maybe Boise or St. Paul. Most of Florida, however, pretty much a goner. Sorry, Floridians. The more I research climate change, the more one thing becomes glaringly obvious. Everything we've done to mitigate climate change so far, it's not enough. Right now, not a single country in the world is on track to meet the Paris Agreement goal. Our global greenhouse gas emissions continue to grow. Last year, they rose by an additional 2%. So despite our efforts, our carbon footprint is still growing at a time when it really needs to be shrinking. And the longer it takes for our emissions to start trending downward, the more extreme our efforts are going to need to be in order for us to stay under the temperature threshold for extremely dangerous climate change. I believe encouraging people to move to new cities, high-density cities, is one of the fastest and most effective tools we have available to us in our fight to save the planet, even if we have to build those new cities first. But there's a lot of work we have to do before we break ground, and not a lot of time. We need teams of architects and engineers and urban planners and community organizers and activists and philanthropists and politicians and concerned citizens in order to get this plan in motion. There's a part for every single one of you to play if you'll accept the challenge. Thank you.